Training and Technical Assistance Project is really to strengthen sexual assault services, particularly in dual multi-service organizations. We have found through our training and technical assistance, and of course, just our own experiences providing services in rural communities, that whenever you house sexual assault services with any other kind of service, typically that's going to be domestic violence services, then inevitably sexual assault services falter or just get sort of pushed on the back burner. Programs often feel less equipped or less knowledgeable to handle sexual assault cases or to work with sexual assault survivors. And so as we talk about this throughout the webinar, there are also just fewer disclosures in rural programs of sexual violence. And so that also just gives rural programs less of an opportunity to practice our skills when working with sexual assault survivors. So that's why our Rural Training and Technical Assistance Project has chosen to focus on strengthening our sexual assault services. Hopefully, over the course of this webinar, you're going to gain a greater understanding of sexual violence and also how we can talk about sexual violence with our communities and how we can structure our sexual violence services to meet the needs of the sexual violence survivors in our communities. So before I actually sort of dive into the content, I just want to say that please feel free to write questions into the chat box. I'm going to just keep presenting and sharing all the things I want to share with you today, and hopefully Wendy is just going to pop in with questions as they come or discussions that you're having in the chat box. So feel free to really be throwing things into the chat box, and that just helps me address the questions as they come up as we go. So on this webinar, I just want to take some time to actually define sexual violence, which I know can feel a little, well, 101, since we're on a Sexual Violence 101 webinar. But for those of you that are new to providing advocacy services, it never hurts. And I think for those of us that have been providing sexual assault services for years or even decades, if you're joining us today, hopefully you will feel a renewed sense of our work. We're going to provide some context to sexual assault survivors' experiences of sexual violence, how trauma manifests, which also, of course, helps lead us to understand how then trauma survivors can heal from sexual violence. And then we'll spend a little time at the end talking about really what is our role as the advocate when we're working with sexual assault services and working with sexual assault survivors. So first, spending a little bit of time just defining sexual violence. There are many different definitions for sexual assault, sexual violence, rape, whatever the word is you want to call this. I often do an exercise when I have the opportunity to do an in-person training in which I ask folks to write their own definition of sexual violence. And then we all kind of look at those definitions together. And while a lot of the definitions overlap each other, one of the things that always continues to surprise and excite me about our work is that every one of them is ultimately different. And so sexual violence is a very personal experience, and folks hold personal definitions of that violence. So here is one definition of sexual violence proposed by the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. They define sexual violence as any type of unwanted sexual contact. This can include words and actions of a sexual nature against a person's will and without their consent. Often when folks are thinking about, or we ask folks to engage in thoughts about defining sexual violence, our go-to seems to be to go back to legal definitions, often because that can provide a nice framework to work from, I think, and also because I think as a country, we really hold legal definitions of things in high esteem. So Often folks really want to focus on what is the legal definition of sexual violence. And I think programs do this. I think when we talk to our community, we do this. When I just talk to people in my life or people I meet on the street and they ask me what I do for a living, we wind up in these conversations, as I'm sure happens to all of you as well. And often folks really want to hold legal definitions. However, because our advocacy programs don't work within the legal system, we're not beholden to legal definitions of sexual violence. And so our programs and the survivors that we work with and we serve get to hold our own personal definitions of what is sexual violence. And often, because of local or state or federal laws, not all of the experiences that survivors that we work with or exist in our communities, not all of their experiences would be considered criminal or fit within that legal definition of sexual violence. And it's one of the reasons why I love advocacy so much, is that we're not beholden to those definitions, that we get to work with survivors and engage survivors to think about their experience of sexual violence outside the context of a legal framework. So we get to serve all the survivors in our community, whether their experiences fit within the legal definition or not. And we get to help those survivors understand that what they experienced was wrong, was violating, and shouldn't have happened to them or anyone. And then we get to help those survivors navigate what healing looks like for them on a really individual basis. And I think that's what really makes advocacy so special and so unlike all the other social services that exist in our communities or the other folks in our communities that ultimately serve, interact with, and help survivors. That is how our services look different. So I want us to think about how our definitions of sexual violence impact how we talk to the community about sexual violence, or how the community conceptualizes of our sexual violence services. Because often our community thinks of sexual violence within the context of really what they've seen on, say, Law and Order SVU. And so that also impacts who calls our programs, who gets referred to our services, how people talk about our services, how people think about our services, who ultimately feels like they're allowed to access our services. So when we talk to our community about sexual violence, when we provide outreach to our community, to our entire service area, when we provide brochures and websites and materials for folks to look at, to engage with, to learn more about our services, I think we really need to hold that concept in high regard and really think about how we define sexual violence is helping our community define sexual violence, and ultimately acts as a gate for who thinks of themselves as able to ask for or join our services. So sexual violence is an umbrella term that I'm using on this webinar, and it includes sort of all of these terms on the screen and much more. So rape, child sexual abuse, incest, sexual harassment, all of these behaviors fall under the umbrella of sexual violence. And when I talk about sexual violence to my community, I personally try to avoid using the word rape, even though that is the word most sort of commonly known and used in our society, because traditionally and sort of legally, the word rape has a very narrow definition for folks. Folks in our community often think of rape as a really violent act, potentially that you don't know the person raping you, that they are a stranger to you. It usually means for folks that it is a penis in a vagina, but all of those things don't necessarily equal the whole experience of what folks in our community are experiencing of sexual violence. That doesn't cover all the experiences of sexual violence that we know members of our community are experiencing and have experienced. So when we use the word rape, we're really telling our community that there's only this like narrow portion of survivors in our community that like our services exist for. I think it's really similar when we talk about our services as crisis-based services, because that really sets the tone for folks that our services only exist for folks who have very recently experienced sexual violence, that you need to be in an emotional or physical crisis at this moment in order to seek services, to call our 24-hour helplines, to access any of the services that we offer. So when we think about the language we're using when we talk to our community or create materials for our community to consume, I think it's just really important to think about the context in which those words are used and what the connotations are for our community members. I use the word sexual violence, but not all words that we can use are ultimately going to resonate with all survivors. So even though sexual violence is my preferred term, when I work with sexual violence survivors, I mirror the words that the survivor I'm working with are using. And frankly, most of the survivors that I've worked with in my life don't use the words sexual assault, sexual violence, or rape. I would say 9 times out of 10 folks call it something like that thing that happened to me, especially when they're first accessing services, when they're first sort of reaching out, doing a Google search, figuring out that services even exist at all, let alone in their own community. Call the helpline for the first time, talk to someone from your agency for the first time. I've just run into a lot of folks that that are really uncertain that they're even allowed to access our services. I think, like I said before, I think it's because so many folks think of sexual violence as only what they've been able to see on Law & Order SVU or on television or in movies, or this like cultural conversation we're having around sexual violence as just such a narrow definition that folks often, I think, don't realize that our services exist for them. And a lot of our programs unintentionally, I think, reaffirm that belief. When we talk about our services as crisis-based, when our agency name only has domestic violence in the title, or family violence in the name of our organization, I think you're automatically sort of just excluding folks, even if your website and your materials and the way you talk about your community include sexual violence. I think that's one way that we sort of unintentionally are sharing with our community who our services are really for. And so a lot of survivors end up calling the helpline or thinking about accessing our services for the first time, and they're really unsure what to call their experience. Because it doesn't match up to what society has told them sexual violence looks like or is. And so a lot of our job as an advocate is to provide that context, to mirror the language they're using, but know that over time, the first few times you talk to them, they might not want to put a label or a word on their experience, especially as they're still sort of navigating what to call it or think about it. But over time, the longer you work with someone, it might become really empowering and feel good to get to call that experience sexual violence or sexual assault or rape or whatever word sort of resonates for them. But that over time, their feelings about that experience, their concept of what that experience was, really might change. And so I think for us, once again, I think the question I'm going to keep going back to as we get to the end of each slide is sort of, how does this information impact services or how we interact with our community? And for me, it says that we really have to have nuanced conversations about sexual violence with our community members. And we have to understand and know that when folks first access our services, a lot of what we can provide for them is education, is just providing more information about the broader concept of what they've experienced, or validating and normalizing folks that aren't sure what to think about or call their experience, that not having a clear concept of what they've experienced is totally normal and valid and might change over time. So I have 2 slides here that are just a few statistics about sexual violence. I think that statistics are only as helpful as we then can think about how those statistics then impact how we interact with survivors. So I want us to think about, how do these statistics that we're going to look at counteract the myths that we've been taught growing up about sexual violence, and what do these statistics tell us about sort of who in our community is a sexual violence survivor, and sort of how do we serve them? So I want you to think about that as we move forward. So for the first one, 42.2% of female rape victims were first raped before the age of 18. So what does that tell us? For me, and feel free, please, to add into the chat box what these statistics are bringing up for you, or any of your thoughts on the slides as we go forward. For me, this statistic really tells us that childhood sexual abuse is incredibly prevalent in our communities, and that if our centers, if our agencies, if our programs are not set up to serve and meet the needs of survivors who are under the age of 18, then we're missing an incredibly large population of survivors that exist in our community. It also tells me that many of those survivors who first experienced sexual violence when they were a minor before the age of 18 might not ever tell anyone. We know that's a true fact, that more often than not, survivors under the age of 18 don't tell a single soul. So if they don't access our services before age 18, they are going to grow into adults that are still coping with trauma every day of their lives. So our services need to be set up to meet the needs of folks who are under the age of 18 and see our services as helpful and healing to them. But we also need to set up our services to meet the long-term needs of childhood sexual abuse survivors. And if our services are only set up to meet that sort of crisis-based, I was sexually assaulted in the last 2 months, if that's all our services are set up to help, then we're once again missing a really big chunk of survivors in our community. That our services should be available and meet the needs of sexual assault survivors across the lifespan. That many a survivor could benefit or access or be interested in our services years or decades after the sexual abuse has stopped, well past the point in which they are physically safe, but maybe not emotionally safe. And we know that for survivors of childhood sexual abuse who are then grow into adulthood, often there's long-term consequences medically, emotionally, to relationships. And so we can set up our services to meet those long-term needs for sexual assault survivors. The second bullet point says more than 1/3 of women who reported being raped before 18 also experienced rape as an adult. So for me, once again, that statistic, what that sort of says to me is that folks that are coming in for services as adults who have maybe experienced sexual violence recently, that we also need to be thinking about how it's very possible that they have experienced sexual violence prior to that most recent experience. And we can be thinking about that and incorporating that knowledge into the services that we're giving sexual violence survivors as they now come in for services. And so the same is true also, of course, of domestic violence survivors. Domestic violence survivors have also sometimes are childhood sexual abuse survivors. And so we need to just be thinking about, as folks are now for the first time entering our services, that what they're presenting as their main need, especially down the road, might turn into a different need, and that we can engage those survivors in conversations about all the experiences of violence they have had across their lifetime, and that is going to be sort of most healing for them if we can think about and engage in all of those experiences. The third bullet point says that in 8 out of 10 cases of rape, the survivor knew the person who sexually assaulted them. So 80% of survivors had some sort of relationship, acquaintance, familial relationship with the person that sexually violated them. So for me, that really says that folks have deep personal connections and ties to the folks who've caused them harm, which of course inevitably complicates healing, sense of justice, what coping mechanisms they use, how we're going to navigate healing in the future. I've been reading The Body Keeps the Score. I don't know if anyone else has read that, but I was just reading this really interesting chapter about sort of how much deeper PTSD and just any form of trauma sits in the body when we know the person who assaulted us or who should have been there to keep us safe. So now suddenly it's not just about the trauma to our body, but also the trauma to our sense of safety, our sense of trust, boundaries, particularly if we're talking about childhood sexual abuse. That is once again, a time period in which we're learning about boundaries and what is acceptable behavior and how we interact with people that love us or who we're supposed to have intimate relationships with. All of those things are suddenly now brought up and deeply entangled in the trauma that survivor experiences, which means that our advocacy isn't just about getting justice for that person or reporting to law enforcement and having the perpetrator held accountable. It means that a lot of our advocacy is going to be about helping survivors navigate what are appropriate boundaries and how we disentangle trauma from trust and relationships that we hold with people. That our services are going to have to acknowledge that survivors have consensual sexual relationships and healthy sexuality, and that our job as advocates also includes helping survivors think about new romantic relationships and how to navigate creating new family structures or navigating going home for Thanksgiving or Christmas and seeing your family and knowing that you might have to see the person that was your perpetrator, or your family might not believe you, and how are you going to navigate that? So advocacy isn't just about, and working with sexual assault survivors then of course doesn't become just about finding justice for a survivor and holding the perpetrator accountable, but it becomes so much more about navigating life as a sexual assault survivor. The next bullet point says that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys will be sexually abused before they turn 18. And for me, what that bullet point really brings up is that men experience sexual violence at surprisingly similar rates to women. And that's something I think as a society we have long looked past. We have chosen to view sexual assault survivors as women and ignored that men also are sexual abuse survivors. And the majority of those men who've experienced sexual violence experienced it during childhood or in teen years before they turned 18. So once again, if we're only setting up our services for sort of immediate based, crisis based needs, we're going to miss a lot of the male sexual abuse survivors in our community that are reaching adulthood, realizing this is affecting their life, their work, their relationship, and that they need to navigate adult survivorship and what that looks like. And we should structure our services and the way we talk to our community to incorporate boys and men as well. The last slide of statistics I have here says that rape is the most underreported crime. 63% of sexual assaults are not reported to police. And of those, only 12% of childhood sexual abuse ultimately is reported to law enforcement. The prevalence then of false reporting is, roughly equivalent to other crimes. The FBI reports around 3%. So what this statistic says to me is that we can't only work with law enforcement as our main partner in our communities. That there are many survivors who have absolutely no interest in working with law enforcement, especially I think as we're continuing to think about the slides on the last page, when we're talking about survivors who experienced childhood sexual abuse, and by the time they grow up and feel physically and emotionally able to report to law enforcement, the statute of limitations may have long passed. When we're talking about survivors who have deep personal, emotional ties to their perpetrator, there might be, of course, for many survivors, not wanting to report to law enforcement, that holding the perpetrator accountable might look really, really different for that person. And of course, survivors of color, immigrant and refugee survivors, the LGBTQ community, for all of those folks, law enforcement might never, no matter how much we change law enforcement or try to influence the way they interact with survivors, they may never feel that law enforcement is a healing way to move forward with their trauma, that they will maybe never see law enforcement as a form of justice they want to access. So I want us to think about what this slide really brings up for me is, how are we going to help those survivors, the 63% of survivors who are not reporting to law enforcement? I think we can all agree that there's a portion of that 63% that would probably like to report to law enforcement and hold their perpetrator accountable, but are scared, that feel that law enforcement won't be supportive, and we can make changes to working with law enforcement, trying to make changes from within the system. But I think that we all have to recognize that there's a pretty good portion of that 63% that no matter how much we build a relationship with law enforcement, no matter how much we try to change and influence the criminal legal system, that ultimately holding your perpetrator accountable through the legal system is an incredibly arduous, long process that for a lot of survivors is not going to feel healing. And ultimately, I like to think of our advocacy services centered around what is most healing for sexual assault survivors. And for some, like I said, going to law enforcement, holding their perpetrator accountable, having their community hear them and believe them, that might feel really healing. But for the survivors in which that feels more re-traumatizing, how then are we going to structure our services to provide healing services to those survivors? I want us to just think about that. I mean, I could do 14 webinars on that topic. Super in depth in that, but since we only have half an hour left, but I want us to just sort of think about that as we move forward, and hopefully you can join me for other webinars and other trainings where we talk about that. I'm hearing a little bit of feedback, but I'm not quite sure who it is.
I know I've checked and I can't find who. Everybody on this webinar is muted, so please be aware that we're picking up ambient noise, and it would be appreciated if you could calm the noise level in your offices, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. Okay, so often when I talk about the need to strengthen our ability to serve sexual violence survivors in our communities, folks want to point out that sexual violence is mostly sexual violence mostly occurs simultaneously with domestic violence survivors, and occurs within the context of sexual violence within an abusive relationship. So a lot of the pushback I get from programs essentially is, I already know how to serve domestic violence survivors, so therefore I already know how to serve sexual assault survivors. And so this image on the screen is sort of my attempt to visually describe why I don't agree with that concept. So many or most, however you want to call that, let's just say many domestic violence survivors do experience sexual abuse within their intimate partner relationship, previous to their intimate partner relationship, childhood sexual abuse. And so I think you can see the big dark green bubble is probably 80 to 90% of the way within the sexual violence bubble. So we know that, you know, a really good chunk, if not the majority of survivors that identify as domestic violence survivors have also experienced sexual abuse. Of course, there is that sliver on the side there of domestic violence survivors who've never experienced sexual violence. But then we have this much larger, lighter green oval there that sort of is trying to represent all the sexual violence survivors that exist in our community. And statistically, what we know is there are a lot, and I would say the majority of sexual violence survivors that have experienced sexual violence and never experienced intimate partner or domestic violence. Particularly, once again, when we're really trying to think about our sexual assault services across the lifespan, including survivors ages 0 to 120, that sexual violence happens outside the context of domestic violence. That there are many sexual violence survivors in our community that have never experienced domestic violence and don't consider themselves a domestic violence survivor, that experienced acquaintance rape, childhood sexual abuse, workplace sexual harassment. Those folks are not going to see themselves in our services if we only advertise or position our services as for domestic violence survivors. And so I think that the lighter green big oval is also what I most consistently hear from programs, is the services that they are unfamiliar with, that feels murky and confusing, and then they're not quite sure how to serve those survivors. When we think about services for domestic violence survivors, I think we're often thinking about really tangible things that we're offering survivors. We're thinking about shelter, we're thinking about food, we're thinking about bus tickets, we're thinking about protection orders. As a person in the social services field that wants desperately to help our community, I get to talk to that domestic violence survivor and walk away knowing I can list all the things I just did for that person and was able to help them with and was able to give them. Gave them shelter. I helped them fill out a protection order. I gave them bus tickets to get down to the local food bank. I gave them a referral list of places they could go to get clothing and food for their children. And I can walk away having this really concrete list of things I know I kicked butt helping them accomplish, right? But I think a lot of times the feedback we get from advocates is that when then presented in front of them is a sexual assault survivor, especially maybe one that experienced childhood sexual abuse 20 years ago and is just now starting to acknowledge that this experience happened, and the survivor is really unsure what they're supposed to do or how to move forward, that what we kind of hear from advocates is, well, what am I supposed to do for that person? I can't help them with legal advocacy because the statute of limitations has run out. And even if it hadn't, there's just so little evidence we know going forward would be sort of impossible. And they're in safe housing, they're in therapy. What exactly am I supposed to provide this person? And it does feel complicated. It's a lot of intangible things that we provide for people. And so that's really the purpose of certainly this webinar, but also our project and all of the publications and webinars we write and conversations that I know TAASA is having with your programs is sort of how do we then provide services for all the sexual violence survivors in our community. And I think one of the really important ways is to structure our services and to talk to our community about how sexual violence survivors exist in our community, and that we can help you with all of those intangible needs. And we can just sit with you and help you navigate it. Start talking about where are the areas of your life where you're seeing it pop up, where you're seeing your trauma pop up for you and it's starting to get in the way. Let's just start there. So a lot of sexual assault advocacy just becomes intangible conversations, brainstorming together, sitting together and poring over what has happened in your life, and then starting to create a plan for how we move forward. But of course, I hear how murky and confusing that is. And so my services exist. TAASA, of course, can answer questions and help you guys navigate all of that. But hopefully that describes a little bit or gets a little bit closer to what I'm trying to describe. So thinking about our the folks' responses to sexual violence. There are many, many different responses to sexual violence. These are just truly a fraction up on the screen. Anger, guilt, shame, struggling with sex and sexuality, shocks and flashbacks, difficulty with all kinds of relationships, romantic, familial, friendship. These are all possible and can happen in combination with one another, and they can happen sort of immediately after the trauma or can happen a long time after the assault. There is no typical way to react to trauma, and there's no timetable for how we quote unquote get over it, or as I like to say, heal from it. Often healing from trauma is experienced more in instead of sort of a linear line graph, it's more of a spiral. And sometimes things are going to get better, and then they're going to get worse, and then they're going to get better again. There can be a lot of backtracking, and often the more a survivor turns in to the trauma to try to really look at what that experience has done to that person's life and how we can heal and move forward. So the more you turn into that trauma to try to heal from it and deal with it, the more is going to get brought up. And so often things are going to get worse before they get better, especially if you're working with someone who has been consciously or unconsciously disassociating or numbing from the trauma for a really long time. Disassociating and numbing are powerful coping mechanisms that can help people for a really long time. I mean, that's why those coping mechanisms exist, because they work for a period of time. But if you have a survivor coming in for services that is wanting to not disassociate, is wanting to no longer numb with drugs and alcohol and food and sex and all the ways that our society has taught us to numb ourselves, or maybe simply numbing and dissociating has stopped working, and now what's left is they need to turn in towards the trauma and really pour over it and analyze it and navigate it and move forward, that it's going to get harder before it gets better. And so part of our job as advocates is really to prepare survivors for these possibilities so that they aren't surprised when it happens, that we can talk with survivors about the reality of how trauma impacts our life. I would definitely recommend The Body Keeps the Score. It's a long read, but honestly, every page is a new fascinating thing to think about when it comes to thinking about how our bodies and our minds cope with trauma. And I think it's really helpful for sexual assault advocates to read. But the more we as advocates can prepare ourselves and learn about the realities of sexual violence and of the realities of trauma, the more we can help survivors then know what the possibilities are and prepare for what the future might look like. And I think preparing for a feeling or an experience can make it so much easier to manage, just knowing it's going to happen, especially if you can, create some really strong support, put some really strong support systems in place. We can talk to survivors about how the more you talk about your sexual violence in therapy and in our advocacy services, that you might start to experience flashbacks. And just so you know, I want to tell you one more time that our 24-hour helpline services are available to you. If you are having a particularly hard day, you can call our helpline and talk to someone that gets what you're talking about. If you wake up from a nightmare and you're having a lot of nightmares now that you're navigating this trauma, know that you can call our helpline at 3 a.m. and talk to someone who can do breathing exercises with you and talk to you about anything other than sexual trauma. If you just want to talk about some silly Netflix show you're watching so that you can get your mind away from the nightmare, like that is how we structure our services for sexual violence survivors. And that's how we sort of start to talk about our services with sexual violence survivors so that they can understand how our services are set up to meet their needs. So just to talk a little bit more about how trauma works. Trauma happens in a social context, meaning that the social location and power of a perpetrator impacts how survivors respond to the violence, how survivors cope with the trauma, and also how survivors ultimately are going to navigate the healing process. So how folks respond, how other folks respond to disclosure of sexual violence also affects healing.
Okay, it will be posted on YouTube later.
And being able to locate the sexual violence in these different spheres of
10 working days
can help us understand the fear and also can help us understand coping and ultimately, once again, how we're going to navigate healing. Trauma also happens to bodies, which I think is really important to think about, that trauma is not just a cognitive process. Just simply talking about it most likely will not help us heal from trauma. That it's important, it's powerful, but it shouldn't be the only way that we're trying to cope with healing. Sexual violence is ultimately done to our most intimate body parts, and sexual violence happens to all 5 of our senses. So all 5 of our senses should be included in healing. Not to give so many shout outs to The Body Keeps the Score, but I'm just reading it right now and it's really resonating with me. There's a whole, I think a whole third of the book is just dedicated to sort of how do we navigate healing. And so much of it is about including our bodies in the process, is helping us figure out how our breathing, how we hold our bodies, where we store trauma in our bodies, how that fits into trauma, and doing a lot of the holistic approaches that programs have really started to engage with in the last couple of decades are so helpful to sexual assault survivors. Being able to include your body in the process, taking a knitting class, gardening, going on hikes, taking a cooking class. All of these things include so many of your senses. They include your body, and being able to do that with other people that you trust and that also understand trauma can be really healing for sexual violence survivors. Regardless of there being a visible injury to our bodies, trauma has a profound physical impact, and it does have an impact on the brain. We have seen that there is a visible difference in our brains pre and post trauma. And so a lot of what we've learned is also that brains can heal from trauma. We've seen it on brain scans. It's possible. And a lot of the ways that it's possible is about meditation and mindfulness and physical practices with our body. So once again, the implication is for our services, we need to incorporate body work into the advocacy that we're doing with sexual violence survivors. And if your program is so rural or small that you can't gather a group of people for a support group, that is fine. That is totally fine. You can do so much of this sort of body work with survivors one-on-one as survivors come in for services.
And Lee, I want to just jump in here. I think since the Body Keeps the Score has come out, there are more and more professions that work with survivors who don't, like, I'm talking about physical therapists who are, that's now mandated reading in some of their classes, so that they understand that when they're working with someone and they have a reaction, it's reawakening something. It's not that they have physically hurt them in the present.
I love that. Thank you for making that point. I think it's really powerful. I'm so glad that other people are seeing how powerful this book is. Lastly, as we're sort of on this train of how trauma impacts our lives, trauma also happens to our relationships. It affects our social systems, our support systems. It affects our relationships at work and at school and at home. And healing is dictated in part by the response of significant others to survivors. So I think what's really important is that we're not just working with survivors at our programs, but we're working with the entire community to be able to better support survivors and understand trauma, and that we're providing services and structuring our services to also meet the needs of loved ones of survivors, because we don't ever need to meet or work with a survivor in order to help them. If we can work with their mother and their partner and their children and their neighbors and their loved ones, then ultimately we're doing good for survivors, even if we don't get to mark that down on our report to our funders that we worked with a survivor. We ultimately are helping survivors heal from trauma by supporting their loved ones and their friends and their family. So I think that's really important to know. Just a little bit more information about trauma, and I'll kind of go through this quickly because I know we have a little bit more than 10 minutes left together. Other factors that sort of help us understand why survivors react to trauma differently. There are 3 factors. So the first is pre-trauma, which pre-trauma is basically what is true of the survivor before the trauma ever takes place. So have they experienced trauma before that situation? Do they have a disability? Do they have a sensitive citizenship status? Are they a member of an oppressed community? Do they have unstable or uncertain housing? What is true before the trauma takes place? The second factor is Peri Trauma, which is essentially just the trauma itself. So how severe or repetitive was the trauma? What was the nature to the perpetrator? You're going to experience trauma differently if the perpetrator is a stranger versus the perpetrator is your father. And I'm not here to say one is harder or less hard, just different. You're going to experience the trauma differently. Your coping mechanisms are going to look different. Your navigating, healing, moving forward is going to look different. And then the last is post-trauma, which is, of course, just what happens after the trauma takes place. So when the survivor disclosed to someone, was that person empathetic? Were they angry? Were they doubtful? Is the survivor afraid of the social power of the perpetrator? How have law enforcement or medical providers or social service providers like ourselves responded? Does the disclosure of the violence impact the family structure? All of those things sort of together, I think all that information helps us understand and helps the survivor understand the violence itself, the response the survivor had to the violence, their coping mechanisms, and where are particular places of healing for the survivor. I think being able to talk about some of this is just helpful, especially as survivors are trying to sort of make connections between sort of their trauma and how the result of that trauma has looked in their life. And then before we sort of talk about the advocate's role, I just wanted to, of course, I can't get through a presentation without talking about rural in some capacity. And I know that Texas does have a lot of rural pockets. You are a largely rural state. And so, and just also because there are just particular challenges that come to rural communities. And so, rural sexual violence, so geographic isolation and increased levels of poverty increase the risk of sexual violence. And so in rural communities, we have increased risk of sexual violence. We're always navigating this thing we're always talking about called everybody knows everybody, right? Every rural program in America has said that phrase at some point in time, everybody knows everybody, which means that there are risks and particular challenges for survivors to navigate because they most likely know their perpetrator, they most likely know someone at your agency, they might know law enforcement or other places where they could receive services. And it also, of course, creates challenges for us as service providers that we know everybody, that we might know the survivor we're working with, that as we move about our community, go to the grocery store, go to the gym, that we might run into survivors, or that people know us, they just know our face, they know who we are, and that we provide services, which of course just makes vicarious trauma even more difficult for us to manage. And also there are a lot of cultural norms in rural communities. Of course, every rural community is different and has its own culture, but generally there is this norm of privacy and self-sufficiency. There might be pressure from the family to preserve the reputation in the community, especially if that is a well-known family or they've been in the area for a really long time. There might be multi-generational familial abuse that has been sort of ignored and pushed away for a long time. There are lower rates of reporting and service seeking in rural communities. I think we can honestly say partially due to the way that programs structure their services, but also that there is this sort of distrust in general of institutions, and often folks, even though we are not, lump us into that category of an institution. And just a lack of privacy, which of course might mean a lack of safety for survivors to come forward. We have really limited local services, so skilled counselors for us to collaborate with, medical care or medical options that are trauma informed. There's less interpretation or translation available, or just even other nonprofits or resources for us to collaborate with. And then of course, there's just sort of uncertain access. So often survivors move away, change phones, we're not sure how to get a hold of them. There's really limited transportation. It's just much more complicated. And so all of those factors are things that are complicated to navigate, and as programs we have to deal with. And I'm here to help you navigate every challenge I just mentioned. Is something I can help you with, is also something that I know TAASA would love to have a conversation with your program about. So And so then lastly, we're going to just talk about the role of an advocate. So I hopefully have provided, as we've been in the last hour, talked a lot about the role of an advocate and also the role of an advocacy program in your community. So hopefully for the last 55 minutes, you've already been gathering some things about what the advocate's role is. But ultimately, the advocate's role is one of exploration, support, and education. Our role is to collaborate with the survivor to discuss and discover sort of what the path forward is going to look like. The advocacy we provide starts with just deep conversations with the survivor to explore the challenges that they've had in their life and also in receiving supportive services in all fields or in all spheres of their life. Just learning more about the realities of what they've experienced and of their life and what their hopes for the future are. Ultimately, advocacy is survivor defined and based on the needs and perspectives and culture of the survivor in front of us. So we're there to collaborate, to hold space, and to discuss options. And there's so many things we can provide survivors, but before we do that, we have to deeply get to know the person in front of us and what they hope to accomplish. So I've left 5 whole minutes. I'm sorry, I tried to get through it all fast. 5 minutes left for questions. If folks have any questions that they have not yet asked in the chat box, I'm happy to take them. Feel free to write them into the chat box. And while you're doing that, I just want to say thank you to OVW for sponsoring this. And I'll put my contact information on the screen, but feel free to continue to write in your questions that you might have for me into the chat box.
Leah, there's no questions so far, but I want to give a shout out to you for folks who don't know Leah and the work that she does with the rural training and technical assistance. Y'all need to go on. Do you have those SADI reports, webinars on your website, Leah?
We do, yep.
Okay, I encourage y'all to go there and watch them and learn from them because they are awesome. And Leah and I have discussed, but not formalized, doing something a little bit longer for an hour and a half, like questions and answers on rural programs and the challenges that they face based off of the findings. It's called the SADI, S-A-D-I program. Leah, you did an excellent job. I know how hard it is to even try to do something with some teeth in it in less than an hour. So thank you so very, very much.
It was a joy. Thank you. Yep. And if you go to resourcesharingproject.org, we have, if you click on the rural tab, we have recorded webinars, our upcoming webinars and peer sharing calls. We have a lot of publications about rural sexual assault services. And we try so hard to make sure that our resources are created with your programs in mind, which essentially means that I know you don't have a lot of time to read a 50-page report or a 30-page white paper. A lot of it is shorter, tangible things, resources you can pick up, print off our website, and use tomorrow. And so definitely take a look at our website and see all the things that we have available. And if you want any kind of a follow-up conversation with me, I'd be so happy to talk to your program, to talk to you about your community and your program, about sexual assault services, or about any of the resources we have on our website. So don't hesitate to email me. I'd be happy to talk to you one-on-one.
One more time, please, I guess, see the website to review for other webinars. And I just put who we contact if we don't receive a certificate. I previously attended 2 other webinars and never received a certificate.
Okay, did you hear that, Leah?
I'm so sorry, I didn't quite.
Here are the resources for the SADI would be to go to the resource sharing project.
Yep, if you go to the resourcesharingproject.org, or actually, can I just share right now my screen instead of the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
And then I can take you guys there and I'll show you where it all lives. Okay. Okay. Can you guys see my screen right now? It's a website.
Yes, we can. I can.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so this is the resourcesharingproject.org. If you click up top, we have 5 different grants here. So the middle grant is listed as rural, dual, and multi-service. That's where you're going to find here on the right, we have all of our upcoming webinars and peer sharing calls where you can register for them. Here we have a lot of papers about serving different communities. We have tools, which are, honestly, I'm not even trying to brag. It's just that I wish that all of these resources existed when I was an advocate. So I would highly recommend just peeking through all this stuff. But if you click recorded calls and webinars, here we have Rural Sadie Lesson Part 1, Rural Sadie Lesson Part 2. Those will take you to our YouTube page. It'll take you right to the webinar where we have the recorded webinar for the Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative. But then if you actually want to know more about the Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative, that is a different project at the RSP. So if you go back up to the top and click projects and you go down and you click Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative, then if you go down here, this is the full Sadie report. It's 100 pages long, but I swear to you, it's 100 fascinating, interesting pages. If you have the time to read it, I recommend. But if you more than likely don't, just click tools. And here are all kinds of tools that have been created that came directly out of the Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative. And they're all really helpful, interesting resources. So I highly recommend. But if you just want like a brief overview, I would go to the recorded webinars that we did. I think those are sort of most helpful to get just like a big picture about sort of what the Sadie accomplished and how it applies to your programs.
Leah, I can't thank you enough. I can't say enough about your intelligence, your knowledge, your willingness to share. I'm always in awe when I hear you present. And I want to encourage everyone to make the Iowa Coalition and the RSP Project your best friends. There are very few organizations I say that about. The only other one that I have said that about is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Please, if you want to know anything at all, go there. They're great. Just one more plug. If you want to know more about how the body keeps score, next Monday, Elizabeth Freisch is going to present that. She refuses to call it the neurobiology of trauma. She calls it the fear responses in the body after trauma. And she is fascinating. So just as fascinating as Leah. So I want to thank you. I think information is powerful. We can't get enough of it. And I loved every single minute of it. Okay, everyone. Leah, if you're done, thank you. I'll be in touch soon. For everyone else, thank you for attending. And have the happy April Fool's Day. This was not a joke, though.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Supporting incarcerated survivors helps changes.